As we all know, the King of the United Kingdom is nothing more than a figurehead. His duties are ceremonial. His role is symbolic. He has no real power in the government of the UK. However, our team of 100% human analyzers at the National Institute of Analytical Analysis Political Institute of Political Scientists have found during our analysis of the British monarchy, that what constitutes no real power is subjective. That is, there are many definitions of it. It is an opinion. And it is an opinion that Americans might not agree with if they fully understood how little power the king has. This is important because it could result in us Americans accidentally giving a politician no real power. And we might not be comfortable with this lack of power. During Donald Trump's presidency, the talk show host and comedian Jimmy Kimmel jokingly said that Trump should be made King of the United States, believing that this would essentially remove him from power like the Queen in the United Kingdom. Let us imagine what that would be like. This presentation seeks to be politically neutral so that it can focus on the idea of an American king. An earlier draft of the script used fictional characters for this scenario. However, this topic is far more intriguing and better elucidated if we use real-life politicians. So we will begin this alternate history timeline splitting at the very moment Jimmy Kimmel made his modest proposal. We will eschew partisan commentary and assume good faith from all parties involved. If the United States were a constitutional monarchy like the United Kingdom, our Constitution would not be written down. The U.S. Constitution would be a set of unwritten rules that our government follows. The power of our king would be based upon what is customarily acceptable. Some of what follows may sound utterly outlandish to Americans, but bear in mind that the King of the United Kingdom is Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which is the state religion. Thus, the King of the United States would be the Supreme Governor of the state church, which would be called the Church of America. The King would be essentially the Pope of the United States. He would be our spiritual leader. And he would appoint bishops, or an American equivalent such as reverends, to our state church. And he would appoint a priest or reverend to your county. There would be no separation of church and state. Though there would be freedom of speech and religion, these rights would not be enshrined in a written constitution. All courts in America would be called His Majesty's Court. If you were arrested, you would be prosecuted by the Crown. And the King would appoint Supreme Court justices to the United States Supreme Court. The King would also appoint senators to the United States Senate. The senators would not be elected by the public as they are now. These royally appointed senators would come from an elite club of U.S. citizens that have been deemed by the royal family as superior to the common U.S. citizen. 4 of these senators would be bishops or reverends, chosen from the state church, the Church of America. And these bishops would be called Lords Spiritual, or some American equivalent, perhaps holy senators, or born-again senators. The rest of the senators would be called Lords Temporal, or some American equivalent like earthly senators, or maybe heathen senators. The President of the United States would no longer be head of state. The King would be head of state. And the President would not be part of the executive branch. Instead, they would be a member of the House of Representatives, ranking above Speaker of the House. The President of the United States and other members of the House of Representatives would be common people, and they would be elected by other common people, like you. Common people would not be allowed to become senators because they would not be members of the elite club formed by the royal family. After a presidential candidate is elected by the public, His Majesty, the King of the United States would use his royal prerogative to appoint the winner to the office of President. If, that is, this person has the ability to command the confidence of the House of Representatives, which in turn commands the confidence of the electorate, which is expressed through the general election. Once appointed by the King, the President of the United States would then appoint people to his cabinet, similar to as it is done now. This government as a whole would be called His Majesty's government. The king and his government would work together on legislation. This is how the United States government would finally be arranged after its transition to a constitutional monarchy. It would appear that our king rules over His Majesty's government. However, the king would only act on the advice of the president. The king and the president would meet privately on a weekly basis, and whatever they discussed would be a secret, just between the two of them. If His Majesty wished to appoint a new Supreme Court justice, the president would advise him on this, and the king would take his advice into consideration. At the start of every session of Congress, our king would visit the Senate House to deliver the king's speech, also known as the speech from the throne. Before he visits, he would ceremonially keep a House representative hostage at his residence, to ensure His Majesty's safe return from Congress. The monarch, wearing the state crown, would then read a speech that has been prepared by his government, outlining the government's agenda for the coming year. If His Majesty's government becomes unhappy with him, they could ask him to abdicate, and if the president advised it, the king would take this advice, and appoint one of his children, as the new sovereign of the United States. If His Majesty dies, again, one of his children, who is next in line of succession, would become the new sovereign of the United States. Radio stations would be equipped with blue lights, so that when the king dies, they can be secretly notified by Washington to start playing somber music in preparation for the announcement. The funeral for the king would be paid for by the U.S. government. And since all currency would have the image of the king on them, it would have to be reprinted with the face of the new monarch. His Majesty, the King of the United States, would have many powers stemming from his royal prerogative. He would have the power to pardon people and commute their sentences, a power currently held by the President. His Majesty would have the power to declare war and form international treaties, a power currently held by Congress. The monarch would also have the power to annex territory. The monarch would have the power to dissolve Congress, and dismiss the President, forcing an election. However, this is not a power he would use against the wishes of the government or Congress. The monarch would be the commander-in-chief, instead of the president, and members of the armed forces would be regulated under his royal prerogative. Finally, the ships of the U.S. Navy would not be designated as United States ships. They would be designated as His Majesty's ships. Thus we would have His Majesty's ship Gerald R. Ford. This aircraft carrier would belong to the king. Not to you, the American people. None of this would be very important though, because the king would be nothing more than a figurehead, holding a symbolic position with ceremonial duties. He would stand in the background, and do nothing. He would have no real power in the United States government.